I didn't remember the night I became his, but my body did. The second pink line appeared slowly, like it had all the time in the world to ruin mine, and I stood there in the marble bathroom that wasn't mine, inside a house that never felt like home, staring at something I couldn't explain, couldn't undo, couldn't even fully understand, my fingers trembling against the cold porcelain sink as the silence of the estate pressed in around me, heavy and watchful, like the walls themselves knew secrets I didn't, like they had been here long before me and would remain long after I was gone, and somewhere down the hallway, behind doors that were always closed and guards that never spoke, Vincent Moretti was awake, because he was always awake, always aware, always in control, even at 3:17 in the morning when the rest of the world slept and I tried to convince myself that this life was temporary, that this marriage was just a transaction, that I was still Emily Carter, a 24-year-old waitress who used to worry about rent and double shifts and whether her car would make it through another winter. Not this version of me standing barefoot on heated floors, wearing silk I never chose, carrying a future I didn't consent to, married to a man who could buy anything except the one thing I kept trying to hold on to, my sense of self. And I remember how it started, or at least the parts my mind lets me keep, the smell of cheap coffee clinging to my uniform, the ache in my feet after a 10-hour shift, the way the neon sign outside the diner flickered like it was as tired as I was, and the sound of fists pounding on our apartment door that night, not knocking, never knocking, because men like him didn't ask, they took, and when I opened it, thinking it was just another bill collector or maybe a neighbor complaining about the noise, I saw suits, dark, expensive, out of place in a building where the elevator barely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors breathe, and behind them, stepping into the dim hallway light like he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once, was Vincent Moretti, older than I expected, not just in years but in presence, like time had shaped him into something sharp and unyielding, his silver hair catching the light, his eyes calm in a way that didn't comfort but warned, and he didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't need to, because when he looked at my father sitting on that worn-out couch, shaking, already defeated before a word was spoken, I understood that whatever came next wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion. And when the number was said out loud, the death that had been hiding in silence for months, it felt unreal, impossible, something that belonged in headlines, not in our living room, and my father tried to speak, tried to explain, but Vincent lifted a hand, just slightly, and the room obeyed, everything stopped, even the air, and then those eyes shifted to me, measuring, calculating, deciding, and I don't know what made me step forward, what part of me thought I could change the outcome, but I heard my own voice before I could stop it, steady in a way I didn't feel, offering something I didn't fully understand. And that's when he said it, quiet, certain, like it had already been written somewhere long before this night, then you'll come with me, and everything after that blurred into signatures and silence and a wedding that felt more like a contract than a promise, and now I stand here, staring at two pink lines, trying to remember the exact moment my life stopped being mine, wondering if it was that night, or if it was something else entirely. I did not scream when I saw him later that morning, but something inside me did, something quiet and breaking as I folded the test back into its box and slid it deep into the drawer like hiding it would make it less real, like distance could undo biology, and when I stepped out into the hallway, the house was already awake in that controlled, silent way it always was, staff moving like shadows, footsteps soft against polished floors, everything precise, everything measured, just like him, and I found him in the dining room exactly where I knew he would be, seated at the long table that could have held 20 people but never held more than one, a cup of black coffee in front of him, untouched, a newspaper folded neatly beside it, and he did not look up when I entered, but I knew he knew I was there because Vincent Moretti missed nothing, not a sound, not a shift in the air, not the way my breathing had changed since last night, and I hated that, hated how visible I felt around him, how exposed without him ever asking a question, and I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something, an acknowledgement, a word, anything that made this feel human instead of contractual, but he simply reached for the cup, took a slow sip, and then finally spoke without looking at me, his voice calm, steady, impossible to read. You are awake early, and it was not a question, it never was with him, just an observation, a fact already filed away, and I crossed my arms instinctively, grounding myself, trying to remember who I was before all of this, before him. Before the signatures and the silence and the way my name sounded different when spoken in this house, I could not sleep, I said, and even that felt like an admission I did not want to give, but he nodded slightly, like he had expected that too, like nothing I did could surprise him, and for a moment, I almost turned away, almost walked back to that bathroom and pretended none of this existed, but the weight in my chest would not let me, the question pressing against my ribs until it hurt, and before I could stop myself, I said it, my voice quieter than I intended. Why do you have a doctor on call for me? And that made him pause, just for a second, the smallest shift in his posture, but I saw it, I felt it, because when you live with someone like Vincent, you learn to read the absence of movement as much as the presence of it, and he set his cup down carefully, too carefully, like he was choosing each action with intent, and then he looked at me, really looked at me, those pale eyes steady, searching, and I felt my heartbeat stumble under the weight of it. Because you are my responsibility, he said simply, and there it was. Again, that wordless line he drew around me, not affection, not warmth, but ownership dressed in logic, and I shook my head, a small, sharp movement. I did not agree to this kind of control, I said, and something in his gaze hardened, not anger, not exactly, but something colder, something older, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me like I was a problem he had already solved. You agreed to terms, he replied, his voice still even, still composed, you simply did not read all of them, and the words landed heavier than they should have. Because part of me knew he was right, part of me knew I had walked into this willingly. Even if it felt like I had no choice, and the silence stretched between us again, thick and unspoken, until I could not take it anymore, until the question that had been clawing at me since I woke up broke free. Did something happen that I do not remember? I asked, and this time, he did not answer right away, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said, louder than the pounding on that apartment door, louder than the moment my life shifted, and for the first time since I met him, Vincent Moretti looked at me like there was something he had not decided whether to reveal, something he was still holding back, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but somehow more dangerous in its certainty. There are things you do not need to remember, and my breath caught, because that was not a denial, not even close, and I felt it then, deep and undeniable. The truth I had been trying to outrun since I saw those two pink lines, settling into place whether I wanted it or not, and he stood slowly, the chair barely making a sound against the floor, and as he walked past me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him without him touching me, he added, almost as an afterthought, what matters is that you are safe now. And I turned sharply, anger and fear colliding in my chest. Safe from what? I demanded, but he did not stop, did not turn back, and his answer came from the doorway, calm and absolute, from everything that is not me, and that was the moment I realized the most dangerous thing in my world was not outside those walls, it was already inside them. The first time I noticed it, I told myself it was nothing, just exhaustion, just stress, just the kind of thing that happens when your life changes too fast and your body cannot keep up, but it was not nothing, it was never nothing, because 3 days later I was standing in the same bathroom again, gripping the edge of the counter as a wave of nausea hit me so suddenly it stole the air from my lungs, and I closed my eyes, breathing slow, counting seconds the way I used to during double shifts when everything felt like too much. But this was different, this was something deeper, something my body already understood even if my mind refused to accept it, and when it passed, I stayed there, staring at my reflection, searching for signs of a life that did not belong to me, and all I saw was the same girl who used to serve coffee and smile at strangers, except now her eyes looked older, sharper, like she had learned something she could not unlearn, and I knew I could not avoid it anymore, so I did the one thing I had been trying not to do. I walked down the hallway to the office I had never been invited into, the one room in the house that felt more like him than any other, dark wood, heavy doors, silence that felt deliberate, and I hesitated for a second before knocking, because even now, even after everything, there was still a part of me that waited for permission, but the door opened before my hand touched it. One of his men stepping aside without a word, like he had been expecting me, like Vincent always knew exactly when I would break, and he was there, standing by the window, looking out over the city like he owned it, like it belonged to him in a way that went beyond money or power, and he did not turn when I entered, but I knew he felt me there, the same way I felt him even when he was not in the room. "You should not be here," he said, calm, controlled, like this was just another routine disruption. And something in me snapped at that, something small but sharp. "I need answers," I replied. My voice steadier than I expected, and that made him turn, slowly, deliberately, his gaze locking onto mine in a way that made everything else disappear, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a test neither of us was willing to fail, and then I took a step closer, ignoring the way my heart reacted, ignoring the instinct telling me to stop. "I am pregnant," I said, and there it was, out in the open, no longer something hidden in a drawer or buried in my thoughts, something real, something irreversible. And I watched him closely, waiting for surprise, for denial, for anything that would make this make sense, but he did not react the way I expected. His expression did not change, not in shock, not in confusion, only something quieter, something more controlled, like this was a possibility he had already considered, and that scared me more than anything else. "I know," he said simply, and the words hit harder than they should have, because they confirmed everything I had been trying not to believe. "How?" I asked, my voice breaking just slightly despite my effort to keep it steady, and he stepped closer, not enough to touch me, never enough to cross that line without purpose, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air, the weight of his presence pressing in around me. "Because I made sure," he replied, and that answer was not an explanation, it was a declaration, one that left too many questions and not enough space to breathe. "Made sure of what?" I pressed, my hands tightening at my sides, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not hesitation, not regret, but something more complicated, something I could not fully name, and he studied me for a long moment before speaking again, his voice lower now, quieter, but carrying something heavier beneath it. "There was a night," he said, and my stomach dropped, because I already knew which night he meant, the one my memory refused to hold on to, the one that existed only as fragments and shadows. "You were not fully aware," he continued carefully, like he was choosing each word with precision, like he understood exactly how much damage they could do, and I should have waited, and that was the closest thing to an admission I was going to get, the closest thing to something human, and I felt my breath catch as everything inside me shifted, anger, confusion, fear, all colliding into something I could not control. "You had no right," I said, my voice sharper now, stronger, and this time, something in his expression changed, not defensiveness, not denial, but something darker, something more certain, and he took another step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the space between us feel intentional. "I do not operate on rights," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving mine. "I operate on decisions," and the way he said it made it clear that whatever had happened that night had not been a mistake in his world, it had been a choice, one he stood by without apology, and I should have walked away then, should have turned and left and never looked back, but I did not, because part of me needed to understand, needed to hear it fully, needed to know what this meant for me, for the life growing inside me. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering, his expression settling back into that controlled calm that made him so impossible to read. "Now," he said slowly, "you stay exactly where you are," and his gaze dropped, just for a second, not to me, but to the space between us, to the truth neither of us could ignore anymore, "because you are carrying something that belongs to me." And the way he said it was not possessive in the way I expected, it was quieter, more absolute, like a fact written into the foundation of everything around us, and for the first time since this began, I realized that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into that night, there was no version of it where I walked away unchanged. For the rest of that day, nothing in the house changed, and somehow that made everything worse, because I walked out of his office expecting something to shift, for the walls to close in or the air to feel heavier, but the staff still moved quietly through the halls, the sunlight still poured through the tall windows like nothing had happened, and Vincent returned to whatever business he had as if the conversation we just had was nothing more than a line item checked off his list, and I hated that, hated how easily he could compartmentalize something that had just shattered my sense of reality, and I went back to my room, closing the door behind me with more force than necessary, my hands shaking as I pressed them against the wood, trying to ground myself, trying to slow the rush of thoughts that would not stop colliding, because now I knew, or at least I knew enough. And that was somehow worse than not knowing at all, because uncertainty leaves room for denial, but truth does not, and I paced the length of the room, from the window to the bed and back again, counting steps without meaning to, the way I used to when I was trying to stay awake during late shifts, except now I was trying to stay in control, trying not to fall apart in a place that did not allow weakness, not openly, not where anyone could see, and my eyes kept drifting to the mirror across the room, to my reflection that looked exactly the same and completely different all at once, and I stepped closer, slower this time, studying the girl staring back at me like she might have answers I did not, like she might explain how something like this happens, how one decision, one moment, can rewrite everything that comes after it, and my hand moved without thinking, resting lightly against my stomach, and it felt unreal, like I was touching a possibility instead of something already real, already growing, already tied to a man I could not fully understand. And that thought alone was enough to make my chest tighten, because this was not just about me anymore, it was not just about a contract or a marriage or a mistake that could not be undone, it was about something that would exist long after this moment, something that would carry his name, his world, his rules, whether I wanted it to or not, and I sank down onto the edge of the bed, the softness beneath me doing nothing to ease the tension in my body, and for a long moment, I just sat there, breathing, listening to the quiet hum of the house, until a knock at the door broke the stillness, sharp and precise, and I stiffened instinctively, every nerve on edge as I turned toward the sound. Yes, I called, my voice steadier than I felt, and the door opened just enough for one of the staff members to step in, her expression polite, neutral, practiced. "Mr. Moretti has requested that you see the doctor this afternoon," she said, and the words landed like a weight, not unexpected, but still unwelcome, because of course he had already arranged it. Of course he had already decided the next step without asking, without consulting, without even pretending that this was something we would face together, and I closed my eyes briefly, exhaling through my nose as I forced myself to respond. "Tell him I am not going," I said, the refusal slipping out before I could second-guess it, before I could weigh the consequences, and the woman hesitated, just for a second, like she had not expected that answer, like people in this house rarely said no, and then she nodded once. "I will inform him," she replied, before stepping back and closing the door behind her, leaving me alone again with the silence and the weight of what I had just done, because I knew that saying no to Vincent Moretti was not like saying no to anyone else. It was not a simple boundary, it was a challenge, a line drawn in a place where lines were not meant to exist, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe it would matter, that maybe he would respect it, that maybe there was still some part of this that I could control. But less than 5 minutes later, the door opened again, not with a knock this time, and I did not need to look up to know it was him, because the air shifted in that unmistakable way, heavier, more focused, and I stayed where I was, my hands gripping the edge of the mattress as I felt him step into the room, felt his presence settle around me like something inevitable, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, exactly the same as it had been before, like nothing had changed except my understanding of it. "You will see the doctor," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, just certain, and I lifted my gaze to meet his, holding it this time, refusing to look away. "I said I am not going," I replied, my voice firm despite the way my heart reacted, and for a second, we just looked at each other, the space between us charged with something unspoken, something that felt like the beginning of a shift neither of us could fully predict, and then he took a step closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just deliberate, like everything he did, and he stopped just short of where I sat, his eyes dropping briefly to my hand still resting against my stomach before returning to my face. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more absolute. "This is not about what you want," he said, "this is about what is necessary," and something in me pushed back at that, something that refused to disappear completely, no matter how much control he tried to exert. "You do not get to decide everything," I said, the words leaving me before I could soften them, and for the first time since I had known him, something shifted in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but something sharper, something that acknowledged the resistance instead of dismissing it, and he held my gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice low, steady, unyielding. "I already have," and the certainty in that statement settled into the room like a truth I could not escape, because deep down, I knew he believed it, knew he had built his entire world on that kind of control, and the most unsettling part was not that he said it. It was that part of me was starting to understand just how far he was willing to go to make it true. He did not raise his voice, and somehow that made it impossible to ignore him, because Vincent Moretti never needed volume to be heard, and I sat there for a second longer, holding on to the edge of the bed like it was the last piece of control I had left, before I slowly stood, my movements deliberate, measured, because if I was going to lose this argument, I was not going to lose myself in the process. And he watched me the entire time, not impatient, not rushed, just certain, like he already knew the outcome before I even took that first step toward the door, and that certainty pressed against me harder than any command could have, but I walked anyway, past him, past the threshold of the room that had started to feel like a cage, and down the long hallway where every step echoed just a little too loudly, like the house itself was marking the moment, and he followed without speaking, his presence a constant at my back, not close enough to touch, never crossing that line unless he chose to, but close enough that I could feel the weight of him in every breath I took, and when we reached the front of the house, the car was already waiting, sleek and black, the driver standing by the open door. Like this had been planned long before I said no, long before I tried to draw a boundary that never really existed, and I paused for just a second, my hand hovering near the door, my reflection faint in the tinted glass, and for a brief moment, I considered refusing again, turning back, running, doing anything that felt like a choice, but the memory of his voice, calm and absolute, settled over that thought and quieted it before it could take shape, and I slid into the seat without another word, the leather cool against my skin as the door closed softly behind me, sealing me into a space that felt just as controlled as everything else in his world, and the drive was silent, the city passing by in a blur of familiar streets that no longer felt like mine, and I watched it all through the window, trying to hold on to something, anything that reminded me of who I used to be. But the distance between that life and this one felt wider with every block we passed, until even the memory of it felt like something borrowed, something I had imagined instead of lived, and when the car finally stopped, I looked up to see a building that did not need a sign to explain what it was, clean lines, glass and steel, quiet authority in every detail, the kind of place where everything was handled discreetly, efficiently, without questions, and of course it was, because nothing in Vincent Moretti's world was left to chance. And the door opened before I could reach for it, one of his men offering a hand I did not take as I stepped out on my own, lifting my chin slightly as I walked toward the entrance, because if I had to be here, I was not going to look like I had been forced, even if that was exactly what had happened, and inside, everything was calm, controlled, the kind of quiet that made you lower your voice without being asked, and a woman in a white coat greeted us with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her attention shifting briefly to Vincent before settling on me. "Miss Carter, we have been expecting you," she said, and of course they had, because in this world, even my presence had been scheduled without my consent, and I followed her down a hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something softer beneath it, something meant to be reassuring but that only made the reality of it all more concrete, more undeniable, and when we entered the room, I stopped just inside the doorway, my gaze taking in the equipment, the monitor, the clean surfaces that reflected a life I had not chosen, and for a moment, I could not move, could not take another step forward, because this was where it became real in a way I could not ignore. This was where speculation turned into certainty, where questions turned into answers I might not be ready to hear, and I felt him behind me again, not touching, never touching, but close enough that I could feel the steadiness of him, the unshakable control that defined everything he did, and I hated that part of me wanted to lean into it, to borrow that certainty just for a second, but I did not. I stepped forward on my own, forcing my feet to move, forcing myself into the chair the doctor indicated, and as she prepared everything with practiced efficiency, I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing whatever was written on my face, and when the doctor finally spoke again, her voice calm, professional, "We are just going to take a look," she said, and I nodded once, my hands tightening in my lap as I braced myself for whatever came next, because whether I wanted it or not, this moment was no longer something I could avoid, and for the first time since this began, I understood that the truth was not something he was forcing me to face, it was something that had already been set in motion long Before I realized I was part of it. The room felt colder once the machine turned on, not because the temperature changed but because something invisible shifted, something final, and I sat there with my hands clenched together in my lap as the doctor moved with quiet precision, explaining things in a calm, measured tone that I barely registered, words like routine and standard and just a quick check drifting past me without landing, because all I could focus on was the steady hum of the equipment and the way my heartbeat seemed too loud in my own ears, and I kept my gaze fixed on the far wall, on a framed print that showed a peaceful landscape I did not believe in, anything to avoid looking at him, because I knew he was there, standing just behind me, silent as always, watching everything, missing nothing, and the awareness of that made my shoulders tense, made every breath feel deliberate, like I had to think about it to get it right, and then the doctor said my name, gently, pulling me back to the moment, asking me to relax, to breathe normally, and I nodded even though nothing about this felt normal, and when the screen flickered to life, I did not look at it right away, I could not, because looking meant accepting, and accepting meant there was no going back to the version of my life where this was not real, but the silence stretched, and curiosity, or maybe something deeper, something instinctive, pulled my gaze toward the monitor before I could stop it, and there it was, not clear, not obvious, just shapes and shadows at first, something abstract that my mind struggled to recognize, until the doctor adjusted something and the image sharpened just enough, and suddenly it was not abstract anymore, it was real, undeniably real, and my breath caught without warning, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up, because even though I had known, even though I had seen the test, this was different. This was proof in a way that could not be hidden in a drawer or ignored in a quiet room, and I felt something shift inside me then, something small but undeniable, a crack in the wall I had built to keep this separate from myself, and I did not realize I had leaned forward until the doctor spoke again, pointing something out in a tone that was meant to reassure, meant to inform, but all I could hear was the confirmation threaded through her words, and I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly tight, my fingers loosening slightly as I tried to process what I was seeing, what I was feeling, and for a moment, everything else faded, the house, the contract, even him, all of it falling away as I focused on the screen, on the quiet, steady presence that existed because of choices I did not fully remember, and then his voice broke through that moment, low, controlled, closer than I expected. Everything is progressing as it should, he said, not to me, but to the doctor, like this was a business update, like this was another detail being confirmed, and something in me recoiled at that, at the way he could reduce this to something clinical, something expected, and I sat back slightly, the fragile connection I had just felt slipping away under the weight of his certainty, and the doctor nodded, continuing her explanation, mentioning weeks, development, timelines that felt too concrete, too structured, and I forced myself to listen, to understand, because whether I wanted to or not, this was my reality now, and when she finally finished, turning the screen away and stepping back to give me space, I exhaled slowly, like I had been holding my breath the entire time, and I stood carefully, my legs steadier than I expected but my thoughts still racing, and for a second, I did not know where to look, what to say, because there were no words for something like this, no script to follow, and then I felt it again, his presence, closer now, and when I turned, he was right there, his gaze fixed on me in that same unreadable way, but there was something else beneath it this time, something quieter, something I had not seen before, and it unsettled me more than his control ever had, because it felt less predictable, less contained, and I crossed my arms instinctively, creating space where there was none. So that is it, I said, my voice softer than I intended, not a question, not really, just an acknowledgement of something that could not be undone, and he studied me for a moment before responding, his voice as steady as ever. That is it, he confirmed, and the simplicity of it made something tighten in my chest, because for him, it was just a fact, something already accounted for, already accepted, while for me, it was everything shifting all at once, and I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something, anything that made this feel shared instead of imposed, but all I found was certainty, and as we left the room, walking back through the quiet halls and into the waiting car, I realized that whatever I had hoped for, whatever part of me had wanted this to feel different, it did not change the truth, because from the moment that screen lit up, this was no longer just his world I had been pulled into, it was something growing inside me, something that tied me to him in a way no contract ever could. The drive back felt longer, not because the distance had changed but because everything inside me had, and I sat there in silence, my eyes fixed on the passing streets while my mind replayed the image from the screen over and over again, that small, undeniable proof that this was no longer something I could question or deny, and I could feel him beside me even without looking, his presence steady, unshaken. Like nothing about today had surprised him, like he had expected every reaction, every moment, every step I took, and that thought pressed against me harder than anything else, because it made me feel predictable in a way I did not want to be, and when the car finally pulled through the gates and came to a smooth stop in front of the house, I did not move right away, my hand resting lightly against my stomach without thinking, as if my body had already begun to protect something my mind was still struggling to accept. And the door opened, the outside air slipping in cool and quiet, but I stayed where I was for a second longer, grounding myself before stepping back into a world that no longer felt separate from what I had just seen, and when I finally stepped out, he was already waiting, standing beside the car, watching me with that same controlled focus that never wavered, and for a brief moment, I considered saying something, asking something, breaking the silence that had settled between us, but the words did not come, because there was nothing simple left to say, and instead, I walked past him, up the steps, through the doors that closed behind us with a soft finality that echoed louder than it should have, and the house greeted us the same way it always did, quiet, ordered, untouched by the shift that had just taken place, and I moved through it almost automatically, my feet carrying me down the hallway and into my room, closing the door behind me with a quiet click that felt more like a boundary than anything I had tried to draw earlier, and for a while, I just stood there, listening to the silence, letting it settle around me, letting the reality of everything sink in without interruption, and slowly, the tension in my shoulders eased, replaced by something heavier, something more permanent, and I crossed the room, stopping in front of the window, the city stretching out below like it always had, unchanged, indifferent, and I pressed my palm lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding me as I tried to piece together what came next, because for the first time since all of this began, the question was no longer about escape, it was about what I was going to do with something that was already part of me, and that realization shifted something deeper than fear, something that felt closer to responsibility, to choice, even within a life that had been chosen for me, and I did not hear the door open behind me, but I felt it, the subtle change in the air that always came before he spoke, and I did not turn this time, did not give him the reaction he might expect, because I needed this moment to stay mine, at least for a few seconds longer, and he did not interrupt right away, which was unusual, because Vincent Moretti was not a man who waited without reason, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, less commanding. But no less certain. You should rest, he said, and I let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh, because the simplicity of that statement felt almost absurd after everything that had happened, and I turned slowly to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am not tired, I replied, and that was true, because whatever exhaustion I felt was buried beneath something far more consuming, and he studied me for a moment, his eyes searching in a way that felt different, less about control and more about understanding, and it unsettled me in a way I could not explain, because I did not know what to do with that shift, did not know how to respond to something that felt less predictable than the cold certainty I had come to expect from him, and I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive this time, just grounding, holding on to something familiar as I asked the question that had been forming since we left the clinic. Why does this matter to you? I said, my voice steady, direct, because I needed to hear it from him, needed to understand what this meant in his world, and for a moment, he did not answer, his gaze holding mine in a silence that felt deliberate, like he was choosing how much to reveal, how much to keep, and then he stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to make the distance between us feel intentional, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter, something that did not sound like an order or a calculation, because it is mine, he said, and I expected that, expected the ownership, the certainty, but there was something else beneath it this time, something I could not ignore, and he held my gaze for a second longer before adding, softer, almost like it was not meant to be heard by anyone else, and because you are, and the words settled between us in a way that felt heavier than anything he had said before, not because of what they meant, but because of how they were said, and for the first time since I had stepped into this world, I realized that whatever control he held, whatever decisions he made, there was something shifting beneath it, something that was no longer as simple as ownership, and I did not know yet if that made things better or worse, only that it made them more complicated than I had ever expected. The silence after his words did not feel empty, it felt full, like something had been placed between us that neither of us knew how to move around, and I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, my breath slow, controlled, my mind trying to make sense of something that refused to fit into the version of him I had built since the night he walked into my life, because Vincent Moretti did not say things without purpose, did not offer pieces of himself without calculation, and yet what he had just said did not feel like a strategy, it felt like something else. Something quieter and more dangerous in its own way, and I looked away first, not because I wanted to, but because holding his gaze felt like standing too close to a truth I was not ready to accept, and I turned back toward the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on as the sun dipped lower, the world outside continuing exactly as it always had, unaware of the shift that had just taken place inside these walls, and I let out a slow breath, pressing my palm lightly against the glass. Again, grounding myself in something solid, something real, because everything else felt like it was moving beneath my feet, and for the first time since all of this began, I did not feel trapped in the same way, I felt anchored, and the realization unsettled me more than anything else had, because it meant that part of me was already adapting, already adjusting to a life I had not chosen, and I did not know if that was strength or surrender, and I heard him move behind me, not leaving, not retreating like he usually did once a conversation ended, and that alone made me turn slightly, enough to see him in my peripheral vision, still there, still watching, but not with the same sharp intensity as before, something in his posture more relaxed, more deliberate, like he had chosen to stay instead of simply remaining, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. "You should eat," he said after a moment. His voice calm, almost routine, but there was something softer beneath it. Now, something that did not feel like an order, and I almost laughed at the normalcy of it, at the way he could shift from something so heavy to something so simple without missing a beat, and I shook my head slightly, not in refusal, just in disbelief. "You always reduce everything to something manageable," I said quietly, my voice carrying more thought than resistance, and he did not deny it, did not correct me, he simply stepped a little closer, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, respectful in a way I had not expected from him, and when he spoke again, his words were measured, careful, like he was choosing them differently this time. "Control is how I keep things from falling apart," he said, and there was something in that admission that caught me off guard, something that felt less like power and more like necessity, and I turned fully then, facing him, studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before, really seeing him instead of just reacting to him, and for the first time, I noticed the lines at the corners of his eyes, the weight of years that had shaped him into who he was, the quiet tension that never fully left his shoulders even when he appeared calm, and it shifted something in me, not forgiveness, not acceptance, but understanding, and that was enough to change the way the air felt between us, enough to make this moment different from all the others that came before it. "And what happens when you cannot control it?" I asked, my voice softer now, not challenging, just searching, and his gaze held mine for a long moment before he answered, and in that silence, I realized he was not a man who was used to that question, not a man who was often asked to consider that possibility, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but carrying something deeper beneath it. "Then I learn how to live with it," he said, and the words settled into me in a way I did not expect, because they felt less like a statement of power and more like something learned the hard way, something earned over time, and I felt my shoulders relax slightly, the tension easing just enough to let something else take its place, something quieter. Something that felt closer to resolve than fear, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because for the first time since all of this began, I understood that this was not just his world imposing itself on mine, it was something we were both going to have to navigate, whether we wanted to or not, and as the light outside shifted from gold to shadow, I realized that whatever came next, whatever this became, it was no longer just about what he decided or what I resisted, it was about what we would both have to face, together or not, because the one thing neither of us could change was already part of us both. That night, I did not go downstairs when they called for dinner, and no one came to insist, which told me more than any conversation could, because in this house, silence was never accidental, it was chosen, and I sat on the edge of the bed with the lights dimmed low, the city glowing faintly through the window, my thoughts moving slower now, not because they had settled but because they had changed direction, shifting from resistance to something more complicated, something that felt like acceptance wrapped in questions I could not yet answer, and I rested my hand against my stomach again, not out of instinct this time, but intention, like I was acknowledging something that had been undeniable for days but only now felt real enough to face, and I stayed like that for a long moment, breathing steadily, listening to the quiet hum of the house that had become my world, until a soft knock broke the stillness, not sharp, not demanding, just enough to be heard, and I hesitated before answering, because nothing about him had ever been soft before, and when I finally said yes, the door opened slowly, and Vincent stepped inside without the usual weight of presence that announced him before he spoke, and that alone made me look up, because it felt different, intentional in a way I had not seen before, and he closed the door behind him quietly, not fully, just enough to give us space without sealing it off completely, and he did not approach right away, did not fill the room with his control the way he usually did, he simply stood there for a second, studying me, and I realized that for once, he was not the one setting the pace, and something about that shifted the balance between us in a way I could feel but not yet name, and I straightened slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because whatever this was, whatever we were becoming in this moment, I was no longer willing to be the only one reacting. You did not eat, he said finally, his voice calm but softer than before, and I shook my head once, not as defiance, just truth. I was not hungry, I replied, and he nodded slightly, like he accepted that answer without needing to challenge it, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to hold my attention, and he took a step closer then. Slower than usual, measured but not imposing, stopping just short of where I sat, his eyes dropping briefly to my hand before returning to my face, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, something that carried weight without force. You should not ignore what your body needs, he said, and I let out a small breath, something close to a tired smile, because even now, even in this shift, he spoke in terms of necessity, of structure, of things that could be managed and controlled, and I shook my head slightly, not dismissing him, just grounding myself in what I needed to say next. This is not just my body anymore, I said quietly, my voice steady, and the words hung between us for a moment, simple but heavy, and I watched him carefully, waiting for the usual response, the assertion of ownership, the reminder of what belonged to him, but it did not come, and instead, he held my gaze, something in his expression shifting again, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough for me to notice, enough to make this moment feel different from all the ones before it, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate, like each word mattered in a way it had not before. No, he said, it is not, and there was something in that agreement that unsettled me more than any contradiction could have, because it meant he was acknowledging something beyond control, beyond possession, something shared in a way neither of us had defined yet, and I felt my chest tighten slightly, not from fear this time, but from the weight of that realization, and I looked down for a brief second, gathering my thoughts, before meeting his gaze again. Then what is it? I asked. Not challenging, not defensive, just needing to understand what this meant in a way that went beyond contracts and decisions and control, and for a moment, he did not answer, his silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, like he was choosing how much of the truth to give, and then he stepped closer, closing the space between us in a way that did not feel like pressure but presence, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than I had ever heard it, steady but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that felt less like authority and more like something he did not often allow himself to say. It is the only thing I will not risk losing, he said, and the words settled into the room with a finality that changed everything, because they were not about control, not about ownership, they were about something else entirely, something that made my breath catch in a way I could not control. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized that whatever this connection was, whatever it would become, it was no longer just defined by what he took or what I resisted, it was something that existed between us now, something neither of us could walk away from, and as the silence returned, softer this time, less suffocating, I understood that this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something neither of us had planned. And that was the one thing Vincent Moretti had never been prepared for.